right. Hello, everyone. I am back for another installment of the quote series. This is going to be quote number 3. And I want to share with you an interesting idea. You guys ever had experience with saran wrap? That's a brand name, I guess, or cellophane, plastic cellophane. And you try and tear it off the roll and it gets stuck because you let one piece of it touch the other side, and then it's almost worse than like tape, where you let tape touch both sticky sides. You can't really figure out where one part of the other side piece meets the part that it's folded onto, and you're trying to pull it apart. Really funny skit they did in Family Guy about that, where Peter is trying to put something in the refrigerator and use some plastic cellophane, and he can't keep the plastic pulled apart. Really funny skit there. Anyway, that visual right there, I want you to understand, is very appropriate to the issue of ego and the rational mind and justifications and rational thinking. As I've mentioned before, the ego solely lives within the rational mind and is within the world of rational thinking, logical-based thinking. Now, when we start to see people that we start to say that they have a mental illness instead of just arrogance or shyness or some other type of symptom of ego, is when we start to see that the logical underpinnings of their arguments no longer are, really rooted in logical reality. And then we can start to see things like schizophrenia and psychosis and other more severe types of mental illness where we see the falling apart of logic within their reasoning. But for people who are not in those realms of deep seated mental illness, the ego is a very tricky little thing, big and little, in that it's always this justification for why the reaction is what it is, why the response is what it is to someone else. On something that's borderline mental illness, but still has a justification, as in people who road rage, right? Their justification is that someone cut them off or someone, did something that they see as an attack on themselves, and therefore they're justified in this extreme response of anger and show of possible force and whatever. And that can devolve into some very serious situations, obviously. So, bad news stuff there. But that egoic response in that case, in other cases, can be as small as a small emotional response of resentment, ruminating over some words that were said in some exchange or something like this. And so it's always justified. Ego is justified. And so it's very difficult to pull out and really isolate what the ego is in certain cases. And today's quote is going to start to lead into that side of identifying ego and really seeing how it can be very tricky. And how do we identify it? How do we see that it's ego and not just justification, that it's ego and it's not just rational logic, that is practical and makes sense? Well, one of the things we can say is that, are we solving a problem, and is it the most effective approach to solving the problem? And that's really what the mind should be used for, is solving problems or entertainment. If it's veering off of those two things and it's becoming unpleasant and it's becoming, suffering and misery and wrapped up in attachment and identity, then we're getting into ego and not just using the mind for what it really should be used for. And that's why meditation is so important, and finding ways to disengage from the mental process, because there's a point at which the mind seems to veer into these darker hallways, into these darker areas, because it's kind of like the saying, right? Idle hands. Once the mind doesn't have any problems to actually solve, then it can delve into aspects of the ego. And the ego, of course, is strengthened through repetition and being repeated over and over again. Triggers that are met with responses that, from the scientific viewpoint, which is one of reinforcing certain neural pathways that are part of this personality characteristic trait that almost basically the whole entire planet is susceptible to, as far as human beings are concerned, that then we want to begin to reduce how often and hopefully cut it down to zero reinforcement of those neural pathways. And again, I also have a metaphysical look at it. I tend to lean more towards the idea that we are not necessarily physical beings and that consciousness is not based in a physical reality. And so that's that other metaphysical side of the ego being an entity, an energy, a wavelength, if you will, almost like a radio frequency, and that the idea is really to stay away from that and remove it from ourselves so we aren't possessed by that particular characteristic. But in this pursuit, we're going to see how difficult it can be. How hard is it to identify? And like I said, one of the number one ways we can do that is this solving a problem in the most effective way possible? And sometimes we're going to say yes, and sometimes it's going to appear that the answer is yes, but then as you look deeper, the question is it really the most effective way? Or is it actually feeding the ego at the same time and possibly at the bigger picture level, at the 30,000 foot view, looking down at the map? It isn't the best approach. And so we're going to get into that and really, really start to delve into this ego thing. I think these quotes are a really good tool, a didactic tool, a teaching tool to start to really understand how do we identify this consciousness issue within ourselves that leads to less harmony, less peace, and a less rewarding life. And so our goal is to live more effectively. Okay, we're going to get into this quote now. Okay, and here is the next quote. Life is too short to waste your time on people who don't respect, appreciate, and value you. Okay, now exactly what I'm talking about here, right? Seems very justifiable, makes absolute sense, and so it seems like it's almost a no-brainer, like absolutely this is a true statement. However, I will begin to delve into this more and show you that no, this is actually a short-sighted statement, and it's one that's still rooted in ego. So, first of all, let's talk about why you might not decide to take this approach to people who presumably don't respect you, appreciate, and value you. Now, again, respect, we could usually tell when someone's disrespecting, but, it could be for a lot of reasons. It may not be intentional disrespect. These all become rabbit holes. Appreciation, same thing. Hard to appreciate someone when you're suffering and when you're maybe, at the most extreme levels. In the last quote, we talked about extreme scenarios. If someone's in enormous pain, kind of hard to appreciate someone else around them while they're engulfed in their own pain. I actually went through this myself when I went through deep, deep grief when my lovely girlfriend died extremely tragically and suddenly. I had, some people around me who took it rather personally that I wasn't as considerate towards them and that I wasn't, showing as much as appreciation as they felt they deserved. And, hey, I get it now. I see it now. I'm not in that state of grief anymore. But at the same time, what was going on there? And I would say their ego was getting, triggered there. And they knew my circumstances. This wasn't strangers. They had no idea that I was going through enormous grief. It's people who actually knew I was going through this and yet still had this idea of, hey, why don't you value me more? Why aren't you paying me more attention, more respect, more value? So again, each one of these, it could be an assumption. You could be presuming something by assuming that someone's disrespecting you intentionally, not appreciating you intentionally, not valuing you intentionally. That's a whole different rabbit hole going down of how have you assessed how, that these are absolutely true and intentional displays or expressions from this person that we're talking about hypothetically here. So that's one side. The other side is this, and I'll bring into something more big picture, big scope. What do you believe this whole life is? What do you choose to believe this universe is? What do you choose to believe? Are you atheist? Do you believe in some spiritual entity, a spiritual presence within the universe? Do you believe in a Christian God, a Muslim God, a Jewish God, or whatever? Any of those institutionalized relationships. What is your belief here? My belief, which I'm not pushing on anyone else, is rooted in several different ideologies, none of which am I an expert in any of those, but has also resonated with me based on the psychedelic experiences that I've had and the layman's books on physics that I read, that my feeling is that this entire universe is completely interconnected And I do believe multidimensional, so both. I believe it's interconnected and multidimensional, meaning that we cannot actually cut anyone out of our lives. We cannot actually be separate from anything, that every part of this universe is part of a whole, and that we are all contributing to that on some level. And therefore, this person that is, behaving in these ways that are undesirable to us, just turn your back on them and coldly cut them out of your life, is in some way a negation of what the reality of the universe is, if you choose to adopt a similar mindset. Now, I would say this also aligns with some of the Christian mindset there, and what appears to be some of the things that Jesus said about, he is who is without sin cast the first stone, and judge not lest you be judged yourself, and things like that seem to be a different way of saying, in a way, basically the same thing. And so I would say, and I'm bringing this up again, this is going to be a concept that I think comes up again often in this discussion, and I used it in the last quote, that, or maybe it was a quote before the last quote, the first quote, that to cut someone off coldly without any permanence, with a permanence that you will just never have anything to do with them ever again till eternity comes, is actually a negation, negating the idea of God. You're basically saying that God does not exist. That's what I would say here. Now, I know this gets controversial. I bet some people are going to have some, really strong things to say in the comment box, and that's fine. We can have this discussion of where am I coming from with that. But that's what I would say my deductive logic goes to with this interpretation, the particular interpretation of what is meant by some of those statements there in the Christian side, and in my more Taoist or Buddhist or even quantum physics level perspective of the universe. And so, yeah, in that experience there, from that perspective and ideological foundation, then this quote does not fit in with that idea. And so now let's get into a little more brass tacks of what would be the value of continuing to interact with someone who behaves in this undesirable manner here. And what I would say is that you have to understand that this person in front of you becomes a tool and a way for you to improve upon yourself, for you to grow as a person yourself, for you to diminish your own ego and your own self-importance, and to learn how to manage those triggered responses. So the way this ego works is that there's triggers, and then we feed that trigger as a response to something, and then we have a patterned reaction. So the trigger comes, we have a patterned reaction, and we've now reinforced the neural pathway with the neural pathway model, or in the model of the metaphysical model of the ego being sort of an entity within a frequency wavelength, we have fed it food and we've strengthened it within ourselves. Let's go with a more practical look at the neural pathway model. With the neural pathway model, the goal is to diminish the strength of these neural pathways that are feeding our misery and disharmony and reducing our effectiveness in the world and reducing the level of reward that life has for us. And so we want to not feed those neural pathways. And so we get a training ground. We get a practicing ground when we have someone in front of us who behaves this way. And therefore, we're able to identify our own egos, our own responses to this, and be able to not react in the ways that we were probably patterned to react, which is deeply rooted in past trauma, possibly also rooted in privilege, definitely almost always linked to parenting in our early lives. And so past trauma processing and ego awareness, and then also looking at things from a very practical point of view. When I was a child, there was a saying, the saying went, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me." Now that statement is a little too simplistic, but there is a truth to it to a certain degree. Now, we live in a complicated life with employment, reputations, relationships that are important to our ability to live a certain quality of life and be able to, earn a living. And since we live in that monetized world with these importance and relationships, words can be damaging. However, we have to be very careful in understanding, what is the level of damage. And also, again, to come back to the faith thing, if you do believe there's a spiritual essence to this world and that it is benevolent, then in time the truth will come out. So what are you getting so upset about if you truly have faith? Now, if you don't have faith, that's a different story. Then these things seem very damaging and scary, and this could end in the destruction of your whole life. And so that's what the issue is there. So I would say you need to really separate that out and take a close look at the practical side of what we're talking about here. In that practical side, what is the true damage? Is the damage extremely damaging? Is the damage really, even physically or at a practical level going to cause serious damage? Or is this really something that you're blowing out of proportion that is really feeding what? Your emotional response to something based off, respect, for instance, is one. Think about Gangsters in the Hood and how they respond to, oh, you disrespect me. And so they're, maybe going to shoot someone over this or do something to that level. And it's not reasonable response to that. Where is the real damage? A lot of times when it comes to words and things that people say, maybe people say negative things about us behind our back or things like this, or they maybe they are late to meetings, maybe they're, no call, no shows. That's damaging to your time. I understand that. But see, that also gets interesting. Is it damaging to your time? Is it damaging maybe to your money? Maybe you have other things to do? Or are you lacking in your ability to be present in the current moment and therefore see what's really going on as far as presence and experiencing life in general? Are you imposing your own plan upon the moment over what God, or to use that word, has intended for you, or the spirit or the universe has intended for you? And that's truly where you see where the ego, and the rubber meets the road, is that at some level we are believing that our intentions, our will, and our ideas are more important than what has been presented for us in front of us. And that's where we feel this deep and strong emotional response to things. And that's where you start to see the difference, start to understand that you're not really solving a problem effectively here, and that you haven't really lost anything in this exchange. And if you look deep enough into the experience, you'll find that you gained a whole lot more than what your ego is telling you you've lost, in that you have now gained the ability to be truly present and develop a connection, a relationship with the universe, with the present moment, with spirit, if you want to take it that way, into the more spiritual or even religious side of things. And so that is what I would say is important here, is that being able to discern. You see how it's difficult to see the difference, right? And even where money is involved, it gets very, very gray. It gets very, very gray. But I would say this, at the ultimate level, never allow your peace to be disrupted. And what this quote seems to be saying that, but it's saying in a way that it's saying, hey, cut off these things in your life, cut off anything that's potentially, unnerving to you, potentially distasteful to you, potentially something that you dislike, and then you'll have this peaceful life. And I say to you, no, that's not a great idea. It's a bad idea. And I'll tell you why, because we're all going to face death in the end. That's why death is such a great advisor. If you do this your whole life and avoid anything that's unpleasant, avoid all these things and block them out, there's going to come a time when you can't block it out anymore, and now you're facing the ultimate end. You're facing, illness. You're facing injury. You're facing old age and things like this that you don't have control over, and you haven't trained yourself now to be able to not have a negative response to that. You haven't spent time really building a bond with spirit and being able to go deep enough within yourself to be able to embrace the non-physical aspect of our universe. And so you've set yourself up for failure there. At least you've set yourself up for a great deal of suffering and being ill-prepared for what is coming. So people in our lives that are toxic and maybe exhibit these, character traits here, they disrespect, they don't appreciate, they don't value you. No, they're blessings. These are amazing gifts for us to build our connection to spirit, to God, to this universe, to the present moment, and really find our true selves. I'm going to leave it there, guys. We're going to have many more quotes like this.